All right, everyone, that's all she wrote for me and episode 27. Wait, she wrote one last thing and I almost forgot. It says, thank you for tuning in this week. Make sure you hit our social media sites, Damaged Goods with Johnny L on Facebook and JL_Damaged Goods on Twitter. Send me a song you want me to share on the show for next week's Damage Request segment. Hopefully the weather stays nice for you guys and there's no snow on the first day of spring. I'm going to leave you guys like I always do. This is your throwback track of the week. This one's for me, and this one's for you. This week, it's Jethro Tull and their song Aqualung, off of their 1971 album of the same name. Did you know, despite the band's disapproval, the album is regarded as a concept album featuring a central theme of the distinction between religion and God? Enjoy Jethro Tull, you guys. I'm Johnny L, and I'll see you next time, right here on Damaged Goods.
Sitting on the park bench, eyeing little girls with bad intent. Snot running down his nose, greasy fingers smearing shabby clothes. Hey, Aqualung, drying in the cold sun, watching as the pretty panties run. Hey, Aqualung, feeling like a dead duck, spitting out pieces of his broken love. Oh, Aqualung, sun streaking cold, an old man wandering lonely, taking time the only way he knows. Neck hurting bad as it bends to pick a dog end. It goes down to the bark and warms his feet. Feeling alone, the armies of the road, salvation at a moat, and a cup of tea. Aqualung, my friend, don't just start away uneasy. You poor old sod, you see it's only me. Do you still remember a December's foggy freeze, when the ice that clings onto your beard was screaming agony? Hey, and you snatch your rattling last breaths with deep-sea diver sounds, and the flowers bloom like madness in the spring. Sun streaking cold, an old man wandering lonely, taking time the only way he knows. Leg hurting bad as he bends to pick a dog end. He goes down to the bark and warms his feet. Feeling alone, the armies of the road, salvation at a moat and a cup of tea. Aqualung, my friend, don't just start away uneasy. You poor old sod, you see it's only me. Oh, Aqualung, my friend, don't just start away uneasy. You poor old sod, you see it's only me. Sitting on the park bench, eyeing little girls with bad intent. Snot running down his nose, greasy fingers smearing shabby clothes. Hey, Aqualung, drying in the cold sun, watching as the frilly panties run. Hey, Aqualung, feeling like a dead duck, spitting out pieces of his broken luck. Hey, Aqualung.
The Dirty South Network is all over the internet. Like us on Facebook.com/The Dirty South Network or at Dirty South Net on Twitter. Drop us an email at thedirtysouthnetwork@gmail.com or visit our YouTube page at youtube.com/The Dirty South Network.
Thanks for listening to the Dirty South Network. Join us next week worldwide. Listen to us on radio, check listings for stations and times, or catch this or previous shows on demand anytime at aircheck.us/show/916. Dirty South Network, all rights reserved.